Hola. Let me begin with an apology that I'm speaking in English. It's all I can do. I hope you can understand, and I'm doubly handicapped because I'm used to talking with my hands, and I've got a microphone, and I have this thing in my hands. So I'll do my best. And I want to begin by just thanking you all and thanking ACCh sobre Chile and Tierra Austral. It's really an honor and a privilege to be a part of this important work in developing standards and building conservation institutions and refining them for what needs to be done in our world. And it was a really interesting workshop a number of you were at yesterday. I found it fascinating and really creative and inventive. And it got me thinking last night. I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience in California and the U.S. Along the same lines, developing conservation institutions, land trust, and the use of conservation easements, which are very common in the U.S. But before that, part of what I'm here to do is just talk about our history in the U.S. And the experience yesterday got me thinking that ultimately this work we're doing together is all about values and conservation values. It really begins with the heart and understanding of the earth and what we want to do to protect it. And thinking back, I was going to start sort of technically going through how we develop conservation easements, and I want to talk about some tax law issues which are important. But I wanted to reflect on sort of my own experience and our experience in the U.S. Along the same lines of what you're doing here in Chile. And going back to the 1950s, when I was growing up, I grew up near San Francisco. And I don't know how many of you have been to San Francisco or the Bay Area, but we have a bay, San Francisco Bay, and today it's beloved, it's extraordinary, we have trails around it, and everybody appreciates it. But when I was a kid, in 1950, that was not the way our culture viewed the bay. Every city or municipality around the bay used the bay as a dump. I don't know what the Spanish word would be, where you take the basura or trash. And I'll confess, I have very happy memories of being with my father, and we would load the car up with all the trash and drive down to the bay, and he'd back it up to the bay, and we'd throw the trash in the bay, and all the seagulls were swirling around. And they're happy memories because I was a little kid doing something with my father, and it was fun, it was exciting. But what were we thinking, or what was in the culture at the time? And this was the 1950s. Things started to change. The 60s were different. There was a new consciousness of the environment emerging, and people looked around the bay and said, what's it going to be like in 50 years? So things started to change. And by 1970, there'd been enormous change in the culture. And we had in the US an event called Earth Day. I don't know if it was international, if it was here in Chile. It was organized in the US by a senator, and it really galvanized people's attention to the planet, to the earth, and to what we needed to be doing in the environment. And a lot of people sort of date the modern conservation movement to Earth Day and beyond. In the 1970s, by the 1970s, going from where I was in the 50s to the 70s, there were polls in the US that 73% or something like that of the people viewed themselves as environmentalists. And so it was a really rapid consciousness change in a culture, which was, looking back on it, quite interesting. So things, and a lot of the institutions that we know today really had their genesis or their birth in that period of the early 70s. So I was thinking of like Tierra Austral or Forecos, some of the groups we've talked about today. They're quite small. Most of the Nature Conservancy was already in place, but it was a lot smaller than it is today. And a lot of the groups that are now international NGOs or ONGs were just little organizations of 3 or 4 people, 5 people with very little funding. So it really, that's the way it started. And land trusts were similar. We're going to talk about land trusts in a minute. They'd been around for a long time, but there were very few land trusts. Probably by 1970, there were maybe 50 around the United States, most local, small little organizations, not working together. And then in the 70s, certain things started to happen. In the law, and I'll talk about this in a minute, there's the concept of an easement, which is a right in someone else's property. And so certain lawyers started thinking, well, what if you had a right to do conservation in someone else's property and put those restrictions on it? But under our legal system, as I think was the case here in Chile's civil law system, easements weren't really enforceable unless they were attached to other properties. So there were some legal issues that had to be dealt with. And other people were making an argument, well, if you can create these things, they have some value, and therefore they ought to be tax deductible. And I'll talk in a minute about our tax system. So we started out trying these things, and it wasn't really clear that they were going to work or that they were enforceable. So the 70s in the US were, I think, a period of enormous innovation, motivated by this emerging consciousness of environmentalism, and I see parallels in what's happening here in Chile today with working on these technical issues that ultimately we're going to need to save the planet, but the motivation comes from the heart and what the objectives are in the long run. So I want to talk about conservation easements and what's it, I'm fumbling with it, sorry. We're going to talk about land trusts, and I want to talk about the role of taxation in the US, which had a big impact on how we do conservation, and then go over a little more of the history of the land trust movement, and finally talk about conservation easements, which are a really important tool for land trusts in the US. So a land trust, first of all, it's a nonprofit organization. The critical thing is that its mission is land-oriented. It's all about acquiring land and stewarding land. And there are all kinds of other ONGs or nonprofit organizations involved in conservation in the US. There are lots of private land initiatives, there are all kinds of them, but what distinguishes a land trust is its interest in the property and caring for the property and managing the property, or the stewardship really. In English, stewardship carries a special meaning. It's really about the management of the property, but management with an intention of sustainability and caring for the land and attention to environmental issues. So it's that mission that distinguishes the land trust from other organizations, and we'll come back and talk a little bit about land trusts in a minute. Put this diagram up because this came out of some discussions earlier this week, just reflecting on the history of developing standards for land trust. And in the US, they really emerged from the tax law. And in this time I was talking about in the early 70s, when we were trying to figure out how to make conservation easements enforceable and make them deductible, there were a group of tax lawyers who played a very central role in this. Tax incentives are a big part of conservation in the US, but they're not everything. For example, you don't have the same tax incentives here, and we've seen already today how much conservation takes place. A lot takes place in the US, independently of the tax laws. But the tax laws in the US are certainly a huge help to conservation, and they incentivize private landowners to participate. So we had these tax issues we were trying to deal with, and out of that, when tax benefits were made available by the government properly asked, well, okay, we want to make sure that the conservation we're supporting meets certain standards. So there are certain standards that are sort of inherent in the tax law, and they came up. Then later, we'll talk about how the standards developed from the Land Trust Alliance. But it's interesting, and here in Chile we were reflecting, this exercise and this work that ACCh Conserva Chile is doing is helping to develop standards in the absence of tax incentives right now, but they may lead and help lead to tax incentives for conservation. So a couple of details. We talk about 501c3 organizations in the US. Those are tax-exempt organizations. They're not political, and they have to be, in order to qualify as a 501c3, which is what land trusts want to do, and they are, they have to be organized exclusively for charitable purposes. And what we have in the US is the tax authorities, the government recognizes protection of the environment and conservation as a charitable activity. I'm not sure that's the case here in Chile. So it's important that the tax laws be that inclusive and pick up conservation and environmental protection. So once you are a 501c3, there are tremendous advantages. One, the organization doesn't have to pay taxes. You're eligible for foundation grants in the US. If you're applying for a grant to a foundation for a conservation project, they'll ask, are you a 501c3? I want to see your tax letter. And finally, and this is helpful to land trusts, if people donate land or conservation easements, they get, or money, they get a deduction from their own income taxes. And again, a lot of transactions aren't tax driven, they happen anyway, but the tax benefits certainly sort of turbocharge the conservation. If you're going to donate a conservation easement and claim a tax benefit though, it has to be given to a qualified organization, which would be a 501c3, a land trust, or you can give it to the government. The easement has to be exclusively for conservation purposes. An important thing, it has to be in perpetuity forever, and it can't allow surface mining. So the perpetuity requirement, the requirement that these easements are forever, drives a lot of the other standards. Because if you're going to give an easement to an organization, a small organization, they're taking on a responsibility forever, however long that is. But that means that organization has to be strong, it has to be financially viable, it has to be sustainable, it has to be run in a professional way, and that, or a committed way over decades. And so that, in part, is what the motivation for the standards was. You don't want to just give it to any organization that's going to be here, won't be around next year or the year after. So, but again, these are all in the tax law in the US. And so before the standards emerged from the land trust community, there were already standards in place that were requirements from the tax law. So this is kind of a quick history of movement. I started again in '70 with Earth Day. You probably can't read this in the back. But around that time, there were few land trusts in the US. They were pretty much a phenomenon in the eastern United States. They fill in a gap. The government can't do everything. And so there was a lot of appeal to land trusts. And then with the changes in the law that made the deduction of conservation, the gift of conservation easements tax deductible, and also the law changed so that we eliminated this legal problem with the enforceability of easements. The law was changed to say, well, conservation easements are an exception to this requirement that easements can only benefit an adjacent property. They can just be held independently. So that was clarified in the law, and that helped a lot too. So there, again, it was the legal community that was very involved in the 70s, early 80s in setting the foundation for the growth of the land trust movement. And as a part of this process, the land trust community started talking to each other. Again, there were about 50 land trusts maybe, and there were lots of exchanges. And so the idea was, well, let's get together and have a national meeting and all talk together. And that was the first rally in the mid-'80s now, and there were 200 and some participants by this time. And we called it the Land Trust Exchange. It was just an exchange of information. But the rally was very successful. It brought people together from across the country, and it's only grown over time. There have been a number of rallies. There's a rally almost every year, and in certain years, Chilean groups have come and participated in it. The name of the exchange was changed to the Land Trust Alliance, which has grown into a major organization right now. And it's that organization that then focused on developing the standards and practices. And the whole idea of the standards and practices was to give credibility to the movement, to let people believe in land trusts, that they could trust land trusts. The word is in land trust, and people needed to know that the organizations that call themselves land trusts were meeting certain standards. So the effort to create these standards was a voluntary effort by by the organization. People from land trusts around the country volunteered to be on these various committees, and they came up with the first standards by the end of the 80s. And they've been revised over time, and they're continually reviewed. But then you have a land trust, and you're meeting your standards. But the whole issue is to prove it to the outside world. How do we know that you're a good land trust? So the idea was they'd set up an accreditation commission to demonstrate you get a seal of approval, sort of that you're an accredited land trust. But it's a very rigorous process. It's very document heavy. And again, some of these things, the more professional you get, the more you do, it sort of tends to push you to a larger organization, to a better financed organization. There's still a large community of neighborhood land trusts and little organizations that are volunteer run, that do important work. But they have a hard time meeting all of the standards because it usually takes paid staff in order to do this. At the most recent rally, and again, I think there were a number of Chileans there, they had over 1,600 people. So it's really grown, and it's become sort of the event that if you're in the land trust, it's our trade show. It's where you go to learn. There are training sessions where you talk to people from around the country, and it's an important institution in our world, or in our conservation world in the US. Most land trusts are of any size and are members of the Land Trust Alliance, and again, you have to meet that definition of being focused with your mission on land, conservation, easements, and stewardship. And they have over 1,000 members, and they have protected, what do we say here, 56 million acres, which are, I always have a hard time converting, but more than 22 million hectares of land throughout. This is only land trusts, and these are the private groups. This doesn't include publicly protected areas or lots of other areas that are held by groups that are not land trusts, that focus on nature preserves, for example, are not necessarily land trusts because they focus on the natural resources of a particular area. I'm going back or forth. So the standards are what we're talking about with ACCh Conserva Chile. There are 12 of them. I'm not going to go through them because there isn't time, but the exercise yesterday was to take the standards and sort of develop them further, but importantly, not to just take these standards. These have developed over time in the US. They've worked well, they're revised, but they fit our legal system, they fit our culture. They're, I think, useful and instructive in developing standards, but this exercise underway is really to take whatever lessons are inherent in these standards and develop standards that fit for the Chilean legal system and the Chilean culture and what works here. Those standards will be a composite of others and unique, which is, I think, one of the exciting things about this project is it's very creative and it's very, very important, but we're doing new work. And so, again, these are the various topics. Similar topics were gone through yesterday in the workshop and developed under each of the standards called principles. There are other practices, and there are indicators of how well you're complying with the process. And again, it's a thick book, but it really has professionalized our movement in the US, and it's been an enormous benefit. And it's helped us build credibility with the politicians, with the Congress, and the land trust movement gets a lot of support, and currently has a lot of credibility. Now, they sort of came out of some problems we had earlier. There were issues with conflicts of interest and appraisal issues, and so like any group, to get ahead of government regulation, the land trust community wanted to regulate itself, but it's done that well, and people believe in these. So I mentioned the accreditation process. If you're a land trust, and again, it's an elaborate process, takes a lot of documentation. The Land Trust Alliance, which is this national organization, set up a separate organization, an accreditation commission, so it's independent. And if you're running a land trust, you can apply for accreditation, and then you are given a big binder of all of the things you have to demonstrate. It's very document heavy. You have to document your processes, your procedures, how your board operates, how you handle your finances, how you handle your transactions, and then it doesn't last forever. It's good for 5 years, and then you go through the process again. But again, it's built trust and credibility in the movement, and it's served us well. So one of the primary tools that land trust in the U.S. use are conservation easements. They're not the only tool. A lot of land trusts just buy land outright, or manage land outright, or accept a gift of property and then steward it forever. But conservation easements, again, they're the right in someone else's property to protect it. So, but the requirement is, this is similar to what I showed a little earlier that came out of the tax law, but this is also the real estate law, now to create a conservation easement. They can only go to a qualified organization. You can't give one to any organization that isn't focused on the stewardship of land. So it has to be a conservation organization, and it has to be exclusively for conservation purposes. It can't be added on to something else. So it's focused on conservation, and again, this requirement of perpetuity. And it's the perpetuity requirement that really drives the standards, again, because if this is going to be a permanent arrangement, the recipient organization, the organization that takes it on, has to be a strong organization that's going to be around for a long time. And again, surface mining is not permitted. So I sort of invite you to compare this to the Derecho Real, which is a little different, but may fit Chilean legal system better than this does. But the question in my mind is one of perpetuity. Now, this also presents a problem. There are issues with conservation easements. They're not a panacea. They're very rigid. They're very static. And if I've learned anything over the years I've worked in land conservation, is that land is dynamic, that landscapes change, and now with the climate changing, things are changing more quickly than ever. So the old sort of view of conservation, at least in the U.S., is where you take this really beautiful special area and preserve it, and preserve it forever, and it's just going to stay the way it is, but it doesn't stay the way it is. It changes. And another difference between the 70s, when we were getting going on this thing, and today is the 70s, I went to law school, there was no such thing as environmental law. Universities didn't have environmental studies programs. Today, you all, the population generally, we know so much more. We have so much more expertise about natural systems and how they work. So I think in some ways, conservation easements and the land trust movement are a little behind the times because they're static. They need to be a little more dynamic, and that's one of the issues we have to work with. When one gives a conservation easement, an important part of the process, which the standards require, is baseline documentation. That means going and looking at the property, doing a complete analysis of it, so that you know over time what's changing and where you started. So again, this can be, depending upon the property, a very elaborate process. Another is stewardship and monitoring. The standards require land trust, if they hold a conservation easement, at least every year, go out and inspect the property. And here again, this is a challenge for smaller organizations. You could have a conservation easement over a forest, for example, that is intended to lower the harvest to a sustainable level and follow certain forest practices that are kind of more than the market would require. So it's a special property. And the land trust has a conservation easement and the responsibility then to go out and monitor the easement every year. But if you're going to monitor an easement like that, it really takes professional foresters. It's not a simple thing. You can't send out a group of neighborhood volunteers to determine whether or not you're in compliance with the easement. So there's an expense built in. And remember, these are perpetuity. So if you do the economic analysis of what's this thing going to cost over time, it can be formidable and challenging. Another issue that comes up, and it's starting to come up more frequently, is how do you deal with subsequent owners? You have a landowner, loves the property, loves everything about it, has conservation values, wants to see this continue forever for other generations. It comes to the land trust has similar values, everybody loves everybody. We put a conservation easement on the property to celebrate that the land is protected. 20 years pass, the landowner dies or sells the property, there's a new owner. New owner's not so enthusiastic about this. The new owner's got this property, it's got restrictions on it. So an important part of land trust practice is to put people on notice to go out and work on relationships with subsequent landowners, to educate them about why it's there. Even so, there can be friction and problems. But once the land trust or the government takes it, it doesn't have any value. It's a liability. And I've got just a couple minutes, but that's okay. So anyway, that's, again, and then to date, under the standards we have in the US, it's very difficult to amend easements. They were written because of, again, because of this perpetuity. We don't want people just casually amending these things. But I think we're headed toward some difficulties here because, again, because the landscapes are changing, because we have to be a little more flexible. So there's a balancing act that has to take place. So for those land trusts that, and government agencies that have easements, these are a number of the issues that they confront. And again, if they're land trust here in Chile, using the derecho real or whatever mechanisms, servidumbres, these issues are sure to come up.